We interrupt our normal program. Normal broadcasting will now be discontinued for an indefinite period.
This station will continue to stay on the air throughout the alert period to bring you authentic information. Telephone service to your home may be cut off. If you can plug in your radio in the basement, take it with you. Use a portable radio set if you have one.
I was reading an article about how during the Cold War, the city of Reno built several fallout shelters. They were located in schools like Reno High School, over at the university, as well as the downtown public library. Others were also located in private businesses such as casinos and hotels. Some examples of those were the Harold's Club Casino as well as the Mapes Hotel. Both of those hotels have been closed, but one that's still around is the El Cortez Hotel. At one point, the city had approximately 52 public fallout shelters, which were created in response to a government plan known as the Kennedy and Rockefeller Public Building Mandates of 1961. The Civil Defense Program was originally proposed to President Kennedy by Nelson Rockefeller, who advocated for shelters in both the public and private sectors across the country. In addition to the creation of bomb shelters, the government established a method of emergency broadcasting to the public in the event of a nuclear attack. And in 1951, CONELRAD was established by President Truman. CONELRAD allowed continuous broadcasting of civil defense information to the public using radio stations, while rapidly switching the transmitter stations to make the broadcast unsuitable for Soviet bombers that might attempt to hone in on the signals. Eventually, the CONELRAD system was replaced by the Emergency Broadcast System in 1963, and then that system was superseded by the Emergency Alert System in 1997. In the event of a nuclear attack, all the United States television and FM radio stations were required to stop broadcasting. Most AM medium wave stations would shut down, and the stations that remained on the air would transmit on either 640 or 1240. Those stations would transmit for several minutes and then go off air, and another station would then take over on the same frequency in a round-robin chain. The purpose, again, of this was to confuse enemy aircraft who might be using radio direction finding to locate the broadcasting source. Between 1953 and 1963, radio sets were required by law to have both the 640 and 1240 frequencies marked with the civil defense symbol. This got me wondering, what would happen to the communication system as well as the amateur radio bands after a nuclear bomb was detonated? I'll discuss a few nuclear tests conducted by the United States, such as Operation Dominic, which was a series of high-altitude tests, and the Soviet Union's K Project tests during the Cold War, which provide some relevant data on this topic. The detonation of nuclear warheads would have far-reaching effects on the environment, infrastructure, as well as our communication systems. Among the various communication systems, amateur radio bands, which would be crucial for emergency communications in the aftermath of a nuclear attack, would experience significant disruptions. One of the immediate effects would be the generation of an electromagnetic pulse known as an EMP, which is a burst of electromagnetic radiation that would disrupt and damage electronic equipment and communication systems. The EMP from a nuclear explosion would cause temporary widespread interference with radio signals, particularly affecting high-frequency bands used by amateur radio operators. However, the impact of an EMP on radio communications would depend on the altitude of the detonation, as well as the yield of the nuclear warhead. Nuclear explosions release significant amounts of energy in the form of gamma rays, X-rays, and other ionizing radiation. As the radiation ionizes the atmosphere, it creates a dense layer of charged particles and can severely disrupt the propagation of radio waves. High-frequency radio waves rely on the ionosphere for long-distance communication, and during a nuclear detonation, can be completely blacked out for several hours. The ionosphere is an ionized part of the upper atmosphere of the Earth and has several layers named alphabetically, starting with the D, E, and F layers. And the F layer is divided into two sublayers, the F1 and F2 layers. The ionosphere extends from around 50 to 400 miles above the Earth's surface, and it's made up of ions and electrons, which are made when the neutral atoms and molecules are ionized. The E region is where our radio broadcasting waves are sometimes bounced back to Earth. And in this region, radio communications are refracted, and the radio wave's direction is changed upon entering the region until it's changed enough that the wave is reflected back towards the surface of the Earth. The D region tends to absorb radio wave communications because the atmosphere is denser than the E region. And when an electron interacts with a radio wave, it's less likely to re radiate a radio wave because it's losing its energy to collision. The F layer, which is subdivided into two sublayers, are most pronounced during the day in the summer. And at night, the F1 and F2 layers combine to form a single region. The F region has the highest electron density, and it's the most critical for high frequency radio communications, as it reflects high frequency radio waves back to Earth. This layer persists throughout the day and night, going through significant variations with changing solar activity. Beyond the F region is called the topside ionosphere. Radio waves that travel to this level have traveled through the densest part of the ionosphere, and as a result, the signal will likely be lost in space. In addition to the initial blackout, the long term effects of nuclear detonations on amateur radio bands include changes in ionospheric conditions. Since the ionosphere reflects high frequency radio waves back to Earth, it can be altered for days or even weeks after a nuclear detonation. This temporary alteration to the ionosphere can lead to unpredictable and unstable communication conditions for radio operators. One of the ways a detonation can create unstable conditions is because the increased ionization can cause signal attenuation, distortion, and changes in the direction of propagation, making reliable communications challenging. The EMP generated by a nuclear detonation could also cause significant damage to electronic equipment, including radios and other communication devices. However, older non digital radios, such as those operated using vacuum tubes, may be more resilient, although they're not immune to the effects of an EMP. The reason vacuum tube radios are more resilient to an EMP is because they have a higher tolerance to voltage surges, and they have less sensitive circuitry compared to that of modern electronics. The extent of damage to electronic devices would depend on factors like the distance from the detonation, shielding of equipment, and whether or not the devices were powered on at the time of the detonation. To mitigate the effects of an EMP on amateur radio equipment, operators can take several precautions. Shielding electronic equipment with a Faraday cage can help protect against damage, and having backup communication systems, such as older analog radios. Radio operators should also be familiar with other communication methods, such as Morse code, which could still be effective during disrupted conditions. Some radio equipment would likely still be operational after a nuclear explosion. However, the effectiveness may be impacted by widespread infrastructure damage and radiation levels depending on the proximity and severity of the detonation. In the aftermath of a nuclear attack, ham radio could be one of the few remaining communication methods. One nuclear weapon can destroy a city and kill most of its people, and several nuclear detonations over modern cities would likely kill tens of millions of people. Casualties from a major nuclear war between the United States and Russia would reach hundreds of millions. It takes approximately 10 seconds for the fireball from a nuclear explosion to reach maximum size. The explosion releases massive amounts of energy in the form of blasts, heat, and radiation. Shockwaves can travel at speeds of several hundreds of miles an hour. The blast would kill people near ground zero, cause lung injuries, ear damage, and internal bleeding. Many would sustain injuries from collapsed buildings and flying objects. Thermal radiation would be so intense that almost everything near ground zero would be vaporized. The extreme heat would cause severe burns and ignite fires over a large area, which combine into a giant firestorm. People in underground shelters could still face death due to lack of oxygen and carbon monoxide poisoning. Nuclear weapons produce ionizing radiation, which sickens or kills those exposed to it. It also contaminates the environment and poses long term health consequences, including cancer and genetic harm. It's estimated that the use of less than 1% of the nuclear weapons in the world's arsenal could disrupt the global climate, as well as threaten as many as 2 billion people with starvation in the long term. The widespread use in atmospheric testing during the Cold War has caused long term consequences. It's believed that approximately 2.5 million people worldwide will eventually die from cancers due to exposure from atmospheric testing conducted between 1945 and 1980. The EMP created by the detonation is a burst of electromagnetic radiation. The resulting rapidly varying electric and magnetic fields may couple with electrical and electronic systems to produce damaging current and voltage surges. The characteristics of a particular EMP event may vary according to a number of factors, the most important of which is the altitude of the detonation. A nuclear warhead detonated tens to hundreds of miles above the Earth's surface is known as a high altitude EMP device. The effects on electrical systems and electronic components after a high altitude detonation depend not only on the altitude of the detonation, but also the energy yield, gamma ray output, interactions with the Earth's magnetic field, and if those systems and components have electromagnetic shielding. A nuclear EMP is usually described in terms of three components, as defined by the International Electrotechnical Commission. They are called E1, E2, and E3. The three categories are divided according to the time duration and occurrence of each pulse, with E1 being the fastest high-altitude EMP. The E2 and E3 pulses are subdivided into additional divisions according to causation. E2 is a lower intensity EMP. E3 is a long duration pulse, which is extremely slow in rise and fall times compared to the other components of an EMP. A high altitude nuclear detonation, which would be at a height above the International Space Station and low Earth orbit satellites, produces an immediate flux of gamma rays from the nuclear reactions within the device. The pulse can easily span an area the size of a continent, and the radiation can affect systems on land, sea, and air. A nuclear device detonated at approximately 250 to 300 miles over the central U.S. would affect the entire country. There's also something known as an enhanced EMP. A super electromagnetic pulse is a relatively new type of warfare in which a nuclear weapon is designed to create a far greater electromagnetic pulse in comparison to standard nuclear weapons of mass destruction. These weapons capitalize on the E1 pulse component of a detonation involving gamma rays, creating an EMP yield of potentially up to 200,000 volts per meter. For decades, numerous countries have experimented with the creation of such weapons, most notably China and Russia. There have been numerous studies and commissions set up to examine the effects of an EMP. For example, the United States EMP Commission was created by the U.S. Congress in 2001. The commission is formally known as the Commission to Assess the Threat to the United States from Electromagnetic Pulse Attack. Many foreign analysts, particularly in Iran, North Korea, China, and Russia, view the United States as a potential aggressor who might be willing to use its entire array of weapons, including nuclear weapons, in a first strike. They perceive the United States as having contingency plans to make a nuclear EMP attack and being willing to execute those plans under a broad range of circumstances. Russian and Chinese military scientists and open source writings describe the basic principles of nuclear weapons designed specifically to generate an enhanced EMP effect. which they term super EMP weapons. Super EMP weapons, according to those foreign open source writings, can destroy even the best produced U.S. military and civilian electronic systems. The United States EMP Commission determined that long known protections are almost completely absent in the civilian infrastructure of the United States, and that large parts of U.S. military services were less protected against EMP than during the Cold War. In public statements, the Commission recommended making electronic equipment and electrical components resistant to EMP and maintaining spare parts inventories that would enable prompt repairs. The Defense Science Board published a report about the ongoing efforts to defend critical military and civilian systems against EMP and other nuclear weapons effects. The United States military services developed and, in some cases, published hypothetical EMP attack scenarios. In 2016, the Los Alamos Laboratory started phase 0 of a multi-year study to investigate EMPs. In 2017, the U.S. Department of Energy published the Electromagnetic Pulse Resilience Action Plan, and there is a published dissertation on the topic in the EMP Commission titled Assessing the Threat from Electromagnetic Pulse. The EMP Commission was closed in the summer of 2017. However, they did find that earlier reports had underestimated the effects of an EMP attack on the national infrastructure. Based on the experiments during the Cold War, as well as information gathered during the various EMP studies and commissions, it's evident that if a country were to detonate a nuclear device in space, it would create an EMP that would harm unshielded electronics within a certain radius on Earth as well as in space. The US and Soviet Union conducted numerous high-altitude tests of nuclear weapons between 1958 and 1962. Some noteworthy tests conducted by the United States included Operation Dominic, which was a series of 31 high-altitude tests, as well as Operation Fishbowl. One of the most well-known was Starfish Prime, conducted on July 8, 1962. The U.S. military launched a missile from Johnston Atoll, which is in the middle of the Pacific, not far from Hawaii, and they detonated it 250 miles above the Earth's surface at a height around where the International Space Station and many low Earth orbiting satellites are today. Hardtack Teak was another high-altitude nuclear test launched from Johnston Atoll in August of 1958. It was detonated at an altitude of 47 miles, and it was one of the two largest high-altitude nuclear explosions. When the warhead detonated, the flash effectively turned night into day, and the initial glow faded over a period of about 30 seconds. It caused communication impairment over a widespread area in the Pacific Basin. This was due to the injection of a large quantity of fission debris into the ionosphere. The debris prevented normal ionospheric reflection of high-frequency radio waves back towards Earth, which disrupted most long-distance HF radio communications. The detonation spread a layer of fission debris in the upper atmosphere and destroyed the ability of the normally ionized layers of the upper atmosphere to bend radio waves back to the Earth. As a result, it cut many trans-Pacific high-frequency communication circuits. This blackout lasted 9 hours in Australia and at least 2 hours in Hawaii.
Today's increasing international emphasis on long-range ballistic missile activity raises to priority attention the mastering of high-altitude burst effects phenomenology. At stake are urgent problems, such as those associated with ICBM defense, as well as the upper air burst effects on radio communications and radar. Prior to 1958, only 2 nuclear shots had been fired at altitudes above 10,000 feet, both comparatively low in height, both of small yield. The first was in 1955, a 3-kiloton airdrop during Operation Teapot, with height of burst at 36,000 feet above mean sea level. The other occurred in 1957 during plumb bombs. On hardtack, 3 high-altitude shots were fired to acquire data necessary to develop a national capability for high-altitude warfare. Yucca, a 1.7 kiloton device suspended from a balloon, and Teak and Orange, both 3.8 megaton devices carried by Redstone missiles. All were fired to obtain effects data for the fulfillment of 3 general objectives. First, to find out how extreme altitudes affect the partition of energy in a nuclear detonation, and what is the radial extent of the various phenomena. Second, to determine scaling laws for various effects as a function of altitude and yield. Third, to determine the effects of high-altitude bursts on the ionosphere and on the propagation of radio and radar signals. To gain these objectives, specific effects tests were carried out to provide a basis for a theoretical understanding of the phenomenology of high-altitude bursts.
The Operation Fishbowl tests were carried out by the United States as part of the larger Operation Dominic nuclear test program. Planning for Operation Fishbowl, as well as many other nuclear tests in the region, began rapidly in response to the sudden Soviet announcement on August 30th, 1961, that they were ending a 3-year moratorium on nuclear testing. All the tests were to be launched on missiles from Johnston Island in the Pacific Ocean.
Johnston Island was the center of launch and experimental activity for the 1962 high-altitude weapon effects testing termed Operation Fishbowl. At the northwestern end of the island was the Thor Launch Complex, joined later by Nike Hercules and Stripey units, plus a second Thor pad. On Operation Fishbowl, nuclear detonations rent the sky 5 times.
The Starfish Prime test was one of 5 high-altitude tests grouped together as Operation Fishbowl, and was a joint effort of the Atomic Energy Commission and the Defense Atomic Support Agency. It was launched from Johnston Island on July 9, 1962, and was the largest nuclear test conducted in outer space. A Thor rocket carrying the warhead was launched from Johnston Island, which is approximately 900 miles southwest of Hawaii. The explosion took place at an altitude of 250 miles. Starfish Prime caused an EMP that was far larger than expected, and as a result drove much of the monitoring instrumentation off scale, which caused great difficulty in getting accurate measurements. The EMP also caused electrical damage in Hawaii, knocking out about 300 streetlights, setting off numerous burglar alarms, and damaging a telephone microwave link. The EMP damage to the microwave link shut down telephone calls from Kauai to the other Hawaiian islands, and it disabled 3 low Earth orbit satellites. In the months that followed, these man-made radiation belts eventually caused 6 more satellites to fail, as radiation damaged their solar arrays and electronics, including the first commercial relay communication satellite, as well as the United Kingdom's first satellite.
On Johnston Island, missile preparation for the July launch of the Starfish Prime shot was one aspect of an extensive team effort. Close to the Thor launch area were a number of tracking stations, including the Pacific Missile Range ship, the USNS Range Tracker, all set up to keep an electronic eye on the missile and its warhead after launch. The bulk of the activity associated with Starfish Prime was the array of scientific instrumentation organized by AEC and DoD laboratories. Installations were crowded on Johnston Island itself, at sea, in the air, and at stations established throughout the entire Pacific area to measure the widespread detonation phenomena from the 1.45 megaton weapon set to burst 400 kilometers high. This far-flung array was pointed solely toward seeking the answers to several objectives vital to the nation's defense needs. Of urgency was the requirement for an evaluation of the effectiveness of nuclear detonations at high altitude for killing incoming ICBMs. This, in turn, would indicate the relative vulnerability of United States ICBM reentry vehicles. Equally important was the need to know the effects of high-altitude nuclear bursts on military command and control systems which require long-range communications. Another must was the ability to detect incoming ICBMs through high-altitude detonation environment for both defensive and offensive applications. One more answer was needed. How feasible was it to test nuclear weapons in outer space? To secure the data for these objectives, a variety of instrumentation was used, such as electromagnetic and optical equipment on the ground, on ships, and in highly instrumented aircraft to measure the production and spread of ionization and radiation. A number of special communications networks crisscrossed the Pacific. Many rocket payloads were prepared for firing into and around the weapon detonation area to obtain data on the fundamental physics of the burst phenomena. Specially designed pods were engineered to be attached to the Thor missile and deployed to pre-calculated positions from the burst. These pods contain different reentry vehicle materials, as well as numerous impulse and X-ray measuring gauges, each item located to obtain data concerning reentry vehicle kill mechanisms. 4 synchronized transmitting and 8 receiving sites operating in the high frequency band measured effects on worldwide communications. Existing military operational communications links throughout the Pacific area were turned on to determine the disruptive effects of this detonation. Extensive radar measurements on shore, ship, and aircraft were made throughout the entire Pacific area to study the effects of military interest produced by the burst at various operational frequencies. As missile, tracking stations, and projects reported their readiness on shot day, the final countdown continued toward H hour. By noon, personnel non-essential to the island operation during the event were evacuated to the aircraft carrier Iwo Jima. The scientific readiness team made its final report, while the launch crew carefully monitored the last checkout. Starfish Prime was ready. The missile lifted off and began its long programmed trajectory. Now the scientific rockets were sent aloft, each carefully timed to be at an exact point in space at detonation. At its 1,100-kilometer apogee, the warhead arched over and dropped to its prescribed burst height of 400 kilometers. Here, in still pictures, are 2 profile views of the Starfish Prime aurora as seen from the Hawaiian Islands 700 miles away.
In 1962, the Soviet Union performed several EMP-producing nuclear tests in space over Kazakhstan, which are referred to as the K Project nuclear tests. Although these weapons were much smaller than the Starfish Prime tests, they were over a populated, large landmass and at a location where the Earth's magnetic field was greater. The damage caused by one of the detonations, which is called Test 184, generated an EMP that was reportedly much greater than the Starfish Prime. The electromagnetic storm-like E3 pulse generated a current surge in a long underground power line that caused a fire in the power plant in the city of Karganda, as the detonation caused an electromagnetic pulse that covered all of Kazakhstan. For the K Project tests, Soviet scientists set up sections of telephone line in the area they expected to be affected by the EMP. Each subline was protected by fuses and by gas-filled overvoltage protectors. The EMP blew all of the fuses and destroyed all of the overvoltage protectors in all of the sublines. Subsequent published reports have stated that there were significant problems with ceramic insulators on overheaded electrical power lines during the tests. A 2010 technical report written for Oak Ridge National Laboratory stated that power line insulators were damaged, resulting in a short circuit on the line, and some lines detached from poles and fell to the ground. Additionally, the EMP from Test 184 damaged radios at approximately 360 miles from the detonation, and it knocked out a radar approximately 600 miles from the detonation. Interestingly, if you consider the timeline of when this test took place, the radios that were damaged from Test 184 were likely equipment that operated on vacuum tubes, which are regarded as having the most resiliency to an EMP compared to modern electronics. Although the vacuum tubes themselves are resilient to surges, as mentioned earlier, we can speculate that the EMP likely affected some of the other electrical components in those radios. High altitude tests have not been carried out since the atmospheric nuclear testing period of the 1950s and 1960s. Therefore, many of the full effects on modern communication systems is still relatively unknown. However, we have learned a lot from those tests, and that information is still relevant today. But to better understand what happens to radio bands during and after an EMP, it's important to know how they work. Radio frequencies are typically divided into bands, and different organizations delineate these bands with different nomenclature and frequency ranges. Medium frequency wavelengths and low frequency wavelengths used for both AM radio and navigation are reflected by the ionosphere. High frequency wavelengths are also reflected by the ionosphere, but not until the wave reaches the F layer. At that altitude, the wave can travel long distances, and this band is commonly used for over-the-horizon radar and communications. Wavelengths below HF are not reflected by the ionosphere, and those can escape into space. These wavelength bands include very high-frequency wavelengths, which are used for line-of-sight communications, ultra-high frequency wavelengths used for mobile phones, GPS, and various other systems, and super high frequency wavelengths used in 5G communication and satellite communication systems. All of these wavelength bands can be affected by a change in the electron content of the atmosphere from a nuclear detonation. Communication systems that rely on ionospheric reflection are degraded or experience blackouts due to this effect. In the hardtack-Teak test, it was documented that an initial increase in the ionosphere was detected, followed by a dramatic decrease in the electron density. This decrease in electron density caused a radio blackout over the Pacific that spanned over 1,000 miles and lasted until sunrise. For low altitude detonations, the low frequency band, AM long wave navigation, and AM radio may be affected, causing a degradation in the maximum transmission range of those signals. Other effects from an EMP can range from components blowing apart and cables acting as antennas to transmit the energy from the pulse to the equipment. Solid state equipment is much more susceptible to damage by large, brief voltage and current surges. As a result, Soviet Cold War era military aircraft often had avionics based on vacuum tubes because solid state capabilities were limited at the time, and vacuum tube gear was believed to be more likely to survive. However, it's worth noting that during the nuclear and EMP tests conducted by the United States in 1962, the solid-state PRC-77 VHF radio was able to survive extensive EMP testing. And another radio that was the predecessor to the PRC-77, the PRC-25, which had vacuum tubes, was unable to remain fully operational during EMP testing. Additionally, equipment that is running at the time of an EMP is more vulnerable. Even a low energy pulse has access to the power source, and all parts of the system are illuminated by that pulse. During Operation Fishbowl, EMP disruptions were suffered aboard a KC-135 aircraft, which was photographing the tests, but the aircraft was still able to land safely. Modern aircraft are heavily reliant on solid-state electronics, which are very susceptible to EMPs. Therefore, airline authorities have worked to create high-intensity radiated field requirements for new aircraft to help prevent the chance of crashes caused by EMPs or electromagnetic interference. It's believed an EMP would probably not affect most cars, despite most new vehicles on the road heavily rely on numerous electronic components. The belief is a vehicle's circuits and cabling are likely too short to be affected because an EMP has a smaller effect on shorter lengths of electrical conductors. Additionally, their metal frames provide some limited protection. Anyway, that's all I've got for now. I hope you enjoyed this video. Hopefully it was informative, and thanks for watching.